father had a little because they never
I thought I could trust you with my cedar. Would you mind if I tried
what happened, but then the actual document. Yeah. There was a lot of yeah, I wouldn't use this to those family members, like la padre, but that's what I'm going to go for. The ultimate point about the real but yes, yes. Which is not really
like that range. The Elmo lenses are cheaper than those lenses. They're also lighter. Lighter. So everything's gonna be just about lighter.
Information.
I don't have any, but I can.
Okay, do a lot of music. Yeah, and I do before and I sure on the camera like
Trying to figure out your setup. Stop it.
Helena has
finance the devices, I guess. Like your device.
Good evening, everyone. My name's Colin Robinson, and I am the publisher at All Books, and I want to welcome you to this event to mark the publication of a book we're very proud to be publishing, Understanding HAMAS and Why That Matters. And before I hand over to the excellent panel, which includes the two editors of the book, I just wanted to tell a little story about what happened with this book last week, because it's kind of indicative of the problem that the book attempts to tackle. So, there's a bookstore in Brentwood, California, in Los Angeles, called Diesel Books, and it was previously owned by a couple of progressive types who sold it over the summer. I'm guessing here, but I think they were probably responsible for placing the order for this book, but they did order it, and it was put on a front table of their bookstore by one of their members of staff, possibly mischievously, we don't know, next to Kamala Harris's book. The bookstore now under new ownership didn't seem to be aware that this book was on sale there. Someone came into the store, saw the book, freaked out. This is basically on video, you can see it if you want to online, and started shouting about how the bookstore was supporting terrorists. One of the staff members in the bookstore tried to have a discussion with the person who was yelling, to not really any avail. The person who was yelling then started asking why there were no Donald Trump books on sale in the bookstore, which was unanswered as a question. In the afternoon of that day, it was Monday last week, a demonstration gathered outside the bookstore, between 30 and 60 people, demanding that the bookstore remove the book from sale. And I think we can be reasonably confident, because the book was still in the bookstore, that none of the people outside demonstrating had actually read the book. But nonetheless, they wanted it taken off the table, and unfortunately, the bookstore acceded to their demands and said that because they were against hate speech and because of threats that they received to the staff who were working in the bookstore, they were no longer going to sell it. So the book was taken out by the bookstore, and that was that. So the point is really, I think, pretty clear here. No one had read this book. There is no hate in this book. It's a book about attempting to understand what the parties involved in this conflict stand for. And I think it's pretty clear that if you're going to resolve the conflict, you can't just brand people with slogans or derisory language and leave it at that. You have to get beneath the surface and find out what the history and program and aspirations of these organizations are. This book explicitly does not endorse HAMAS. It attempts to investigate what it is as an organization and why it should be taken seriously. So we wrote to PEN, the American Writers Organization, and complained about what had happened with the book at this bookstore, and they put out a statement saying that they were upset with what had happened. So that was good, and we hope that there are many bookstores around the United States that are going to be stocking this and putting it on their tables and allowing people to find out what the actual issues, what the organizations who are party to this conflict really stand for. And we're very proud to be publishing it in that endeavor. We're very proud to have the editors of the book here tonight. So I just want to introduce David Wildman, who's going to moderate the discussion, and who will introduce Helena and Rami. So I'm just going to introduce him using a note that Helena's given me. He's a distinguished lecturer. David Wildman is a distinguished lecturer in a leader in the anti-apartheid movement from South Africa, a long-time leader in the Palestinian rights movement in US churches and society. He's currently the main rep to the UN of the Global Ministries of the United Methodist Church. And he's also their Middle East area liaison. And he's also now the co-chair of the NGO Working Group on Palestine and the United Nations. Just before I pass it over to David, I just want to say a couple of thanks to people, especially to Francis Guy Club, who hosts these events for All Books in their wonderful bar on Avenue C. We've got a whole program of events coming up, and I think there's a flyer on the table, but we've been running these events 1 or 2 a month, and it's important for us to try and get progressive ideas out there in person as well as through our books and online. So thanks very much to Francis Guy Club for hosting this event, and I want to give a shout out to Juan Diego, who's selling the books at the front there. It's the sharp end of the business, and if you get a chance, please do say hi to him, buy a copy for your friends. You won't be disappointed with it. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Colin, and thanks to all the team with Or Books. So I don't know all the staff, but I know this was a team effort. So thank you so much and for hosting it here, and thanks to all of you who are here and have taken time out of your evening to be together for this really important discussion. As Colin mentioned, I'm David Wildman. I'm staff with the United Methodist Church. All those long things are a way of saying I'm a bureaucrat, but I'm one who tries to be an activist in those positions. So it's nearly a year of Israeli genocide against the Palestinian people, an expanding war. There was already a regional war. But that's on top of over 57 years of military occupation, over 76 years of the Nakba, ongoing Nakba. So I think we need to acknowledge this is not new, but it's more urgent than ever to be having discussions and to take a little time away to dig deeper, as this book has done. And I want most of the time to be with Helena and Rami being able, and then you being able to engage with some questions. So I'd like to introduce both of them in a minute, but I want to just say a little bit about my own role at the United Methodist Church and like why it's an honor for me to be invited to moderate this discussion. In 1968, the United Methodist Church formed of two denominations coming together, and when we had our general conference, and we've been a church that's often been divided against each other, we adopted a statement in 1968, a year after the Six-Day War, calling for an end to all arms transfers to the entire Middle East. We affirmed, even if we disagreed on other things, that more arms is like trying to put a fire out with gasoline. Now, sadly, the US government has been the greatest violator of United Methodist principles in terms of war is not the way to solve problems. And so we're here today saying we've held that consistently throughout all these years of continuing to lift up to say arms are not the solution. So way before the arms embargo, the call for an arms embargo, that the grassroots around the world is calling for now, that humanitarian organizations, human rights organizations, activist organizations are all calling for an arms embargo to stop the slaughter. We've been there too, and we need to keep raising our voices until that day that the arms embargo forces the governments to stop the slaughter. And I've listened to the Security Council meetings, and every single Security Council meeting, and there was quite a few, there was one today, many of the states lift up condemning Hamas as a whole, as part of their speech, before they get to the situation of Palestinians who've had hospitals bombed, etc. And so to talk about understanding Hamas, as this book suggests, and why that matters. It matters because so many have invoked the name of Hamas without understanding the organization at all to justify incredible violence and slaughter. And so I think that it's really important, and glad that you're taking the time also to dig into this conversation with Helena and Rami. So with that brief little introduction, let me just say that Helena Cobban is a publisher, a longtime writer. She did a weekly column for the Christian Science Monitor for many years, and about 14 years ago, 2010 I think it was, founded Just World Books to say that we need to do this digging deeper of getting things out there on Palestine, Israel, the Middle East. And so there's too many books to count, but this is the latest. Rami Khouri, and I'll introduce them both and then turn it over to them, is a longtime journalist, academic. I love that mix of and in fact, I found out when he got to New York because I was listening to BBC on Monday and it said live from New York. Rami was offering his analysis. And I know you have family in Beirut, in Amman, in Nazareth, in the Galilee. And so I know this for you, and I imagine for many in the room, this is also deeply personal. And so I think let's just, before we turn it over to you, just have a brief moment of silence to remember all those whose lives have been cut short, completely unnecessarily, and sadly with the complicity of the US government. want to just go to the title, and Helena, we'll start with you, and then we'll go to Rami, and say, understanding Hamas, and why does this matter? So maybe you could just answer that question. It comes out of a series of webinars from last May, and it's amazing the turnaround. So maybe just why does this matter right now? To have this book and what's in it with the folks that you interviewed. So Helena first.
Okay, well, thank you so much, David, for being with us. It's always a pleasure to be next to you on any panel. Big thanks to Colin and the rest of the team at All Books for working with us. I'm here in my capacity as the president of Just World Educational, which is actually quite separate from the publishing company. Just World Educational is a non-profit devoted to public education with a special emphasis on the affairs of the region of the world that I call West Asia, but when I was growing up in England, we called it the Middle East because we were Eurocentric. So we did put on, and Rami is one of the 8 distinguished board members of Just World Educational. And back in March, we decided, there are a lot of people doing work on humanitarian things in Gaza in particular. And it's hard work, and it's emotionally wrenching to do that work, and it's very important. But you're not going to get an end to the suffering until there is a political agreement, is the short answer for why it matters to understand Hamas. I mean, I've worked on the Rwandan genocide, for example. I did a book about genocides in sub-Saharan Africa, and I remember there was somebody in Uganda who was downriver from Rwanda during the genocide, and a journalist went and asked, so, what are you doing here? Well, we're taking the bodies out of the river and burying them, but could you please do something in Rwanda so that there are no more bodies? And that's the way that I look at the political education task that we're taking on with understanding Hamas and why that matters. Because David expressed that brilliantly, that if every political statement, every political actor, every political party is asked to start off by condemning Hamas, then we're not going to get the ceasefire that we so desperately need. And it is very strange that actually our administration here in the United States has been negotiating with Hamas since November, indirectly, but definitely negotiating. And they negotiated a 4-day ceasefire successfully in November. It was then extended for a further 2 days, and then for a further 1 day, for a 7-day ceasefire, and it worked. Hostages and political prisoners were released. There was a ceasefire, and it could have been built upon for a much more lasting ceasefire, instead of which our administration just let the carnage resume with the effects that we've seen today. So that's why it matters. I just want to say a few quick things about the project from which the book arose. So we did decide in Just World Educational back in March that, because we're small and agile and committed and have strong principles, and we don't actually have a lot of resources. Where do we focus them? We focus them on the political piece of demonizing this organization, Hamas. And as Colin has said, as we have written in the book, as we said during the webinars, we're not there to build support for Hamas. We're not there just mindlessly to oppose it and to demonize it. We want to understand it. So what we did, we invited 5 world-class experts on the movement. Most of them have published well-regarded books. We had Dr. Paula Caridi, who speaks with a wonderful, rich Italian accent. We invited Dr. Khouri. We invited somebody that I had never encountered before called Dr. Jeroen Gunning, who's a Dutch English professor who is one of the founders of this intriguing new academic field called critical terrorism studies that seeks to interrogate the whole big, very nicely funded field of terrorism studies in the West. And then we invited Moain Rabbani, well-known analyst, very smart political thinker, and Dr. Azam Tamimi, who is a senior figure in Islam and democracy movement, who lives in London. So 3 of our experts are Palestinians, 2 of them are Europeans, and I'm really proud that we were able, Rami and I co-hosted these webinars, and you can find them. They're still on our YouTube channel, Just World Educational. But you know, looking at 6 hours of videos, some people love to do it. Some people like to learn things through text, and I'm more of a text person, I want to say. So we took the transcripts from these webinars and lightly edited them. As anybody who's ever worked with transcripts knows, you have to do that. And then we made the book with the help of All Books and their very speedy turnaround system. So the book will be available on well-known international retailers on October 8th. It's already available in several bookstores and can be ordered through the All Books website. And you know, there are many things that we learned through this process. For me, there's a little bit of a historical background because I grew up in England and, you know, in an era of decolonization when every week, it seemed, a group that the British Empire had previously denounced as nothing but a bunch of ragtag terrorists and very primitive peoples, their leader would be, you know, suddenly President Jomo Kenyatta, or, you know, President this, President that, and the British Governor General would haul down the Union Jack, and the other people who previously had maybe been in jail 2 days earlier and been hunted throughout the whole of this country in the global south, they would finally get their independence. So that's part of the background for me in support of, continuing support of anti-colonial movements. And the other part of the background is after I came to this country, I came here after having worked as a journalist in Beirut to write a book at Harvard and then at Georgetown University that was a political study of the Palestine Liberation Organization. Now, it's hard to remember now, but back in the 1980s, you'd say the word PLO, and it was like, oh my Lord, terrorists, you know, just memories of the Munich massacre and all this. You're just a terrorist lover, and you're an anti-Semite, and guess what? You know, September 1993, there I was on the White House lawn when Yasser Arafat and Yitzhak Rabin and President Clinton all clinched a political deal. Now, that did not resolve the issue, but I'm just saying that putting people into boxes and demonizing them and delegitimizing them doesn't actually get you anywhere unless you can understand where these movements come from. And this is a movement with long history. It's gone through many developments, and we learned about many of those in our webinar series, and we presented those learnings in the book. We wanted to make both the webinar series and the book very accessible to a non-specialist public. So I hope that when you read it, you will agree with that. We also included at the back some vital documentation because we think that, there is so little known about the history of the movement. We just put in 6 pieces of documentation that we think will be helpful. So, sorry I went on a bit there, Dave.
No, that's good. It's good to know the background of how this came together. And let me just say, it's a great read. It's very conversational because it draws out of those webinars. So I think I highly recommend it. So, but Rami, let's turn to you. Why this book now and why it matters?
Why this book now? Because Helena called me up one day and said, "Ron, we got to do a book." I said, "Yes, ma'am." Knowing that she would do a great job leading the project, knowing that the 5 interviews or sessions we had with the experts were outstanding in terms of providing factual, credible, research-based, sensitive, and relevant knowledge, which is not something you get in the media here, even in some of the education systems and the public sphere, and certainly in the government sphere. You don't get that kind of insight. So when she suggested this, I immediately said, yes, I'd be happy to do it, and off we went. So, and I must claim a little bit of credit for coming up with most of the title. I think that was my, she had some very complicated British colonial title that I quickly disabused her of that. But she's not colonial, she's anti-colonial. But I just said, look, who are these people? What is Hamas? Why do we need to understand them? So the reasons I'll tell you, 4 points basically. One, Hamas is the most prominent resistance movement in Palestine, using military and other means. And whatever you think of them, they are the people leading the resistance. And if we're trying to resolve this conflict, which I think we all are, the conflict between Palestine and Israel, which has grown into a conflict between Israel and Arab countries and Israel and Iran. It started out just as a localized conflict between Zionist pioneer Zionist settlers who came in the early 20th, late 19th, early 20th century, and then around 1920 you started to get the communal clashes between indigenous Palestinian Arabs and the Jewish settlers, and that's the word they used themselves, the settlements and colonies. And then it became an active conflict with the help of the British, and it then expanded to the rest of the Arab world. So we want to resolve this conflict. I've spent my whole adult life, the last 55 years of my life, working on this on the side. I'm a journalist by profession. I masquerade as an academic now and then, but basically I'm a journalist. I research, I interview, I observe, I analyze, and I write. And I try to share with the public the knowledge that I gain from my work. And throughout my history, and still today, I've always been involved with efforts to resolve the Palestine-Israel conflict, not in the sense that I'm a negotiator, but in my work as a journalist to help inform the public. And this started very suddenly one day in 1966, after the June War. I was a freshman at university in upstate New York, and the war happened. Israel won quickly. This was quite a decisive victory. Shocked the Arab world, brought great joy to Israel and many Jews, and suddenly I saw a scene I had never experienced in my life, which was thousands of people out in the main part of the university where I was, demonstrating peacefully, happily, dancing, singing, giving money to Israel. I'd never seen anything like that. And I didn't quite know how to react to it. I had never been very political in high school in this sense, even though my sentiments were clear. But what happened was immediately people started holding debates and discussions and panel discussions and TV interviews, and when they saw that I was a Palestinian journalist, they said, "Later, grab this guy, you must be able to do this." So I started doing debates and panel discussions with the Hillel students and the B'nai B'rith students at the university, and then the local TV stations, and that was my entry into this world. And I realized very quickly that mainstream United States thinking, remember this is 1966, mainstream United States perceptions of this conflict were 95% wrong, based on narratives that were either lies, or fiction, or exaggeration, or distortion, or diversion. Get away from the main point and just talk about other issues. And the Palestinians didn't exist back then. People didn't know, they said there's all these Arab states, Egypt, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, they can all make peace with Israel. And I kept telling them, well, that's not the main issue. The main issue is the Palestinians and the Israelis. So I learned very quickly and clearly that there was a massive disjuncture between the knowledge, the public perceptions in the United States and the realities on the ground there. But I also realized very quickly that the most important thing for me personally, and for anybody involved in this, was to keep the discussion going with the other side. And I quickly learned that it was not very useful just to try to score a point, like they do on TV here or other public debates. Scoring points or catching somebody, offline or something, that's not very useful. This is not an entertainment process. This is a serious issue that impacts millions and millions of people. So I learned that engaging with the other side was critically important, and I've done that ever since 1966. And through my journalism work, I got involved with unofficial track 2 diplomacy meetings with former officials and, on both sides, and then I would do research on my own. So I spent my whole adult life engaging with Israelis or pro-Israeli Americans and Westerners, including settlers and government people and all kinds of people who I disagreed with. But I needed to understand from them, what do they want? What are they afraid of? What torments them? What is it that drives them to be so vicious and violent against the Palestinians if they're Israelis, and if they're Americans, what drives them to be so wildly prejudiced against Palestine and for Israel? I needed to figure that out as a journalist and as an individual. And so I spent my whole life doing this, and that's why when this came up, I immediately said, we need to do something to help people understand who these Hamas people are. Where do they come from? What do they do? What do they want? How should we deal with them? So this is one reason we did this, to help people who are interested to know accurately what is Hamas, why do they do what they do and say what they say, and by understanding Hamas a little bit better, and they are the last standing Palestinian resistance group, political, social, cultural, religious, military, nationalist, ideological, in every dimension of life. They're the last active, serious resistance group. And their name, by the way, Hamas, Haraka al-Muqawama al-Islamiyya. Hamas is an acronym in Arabic for the Islamic Resistance Movement. Resistance is the operative word in their name, not Islamic, not movement. They're both important, but resistance is the important word. The people need to understand what that means, and this is one way to do it. And it's important not just to abstractly understand them, but to ultimately for people to engage with them. It doesn't mean you sign a letter of support or invite them to your home, but it means that you engage with them, you talk to them, like I talk to Israelis and American pro-Israeli zealots, to understand what it is that drove them, so that we can figure out where is the middle ground, where both of our rights could be achieved. So the best analogy I would give you is if the United States government had taken this attitude and engaged with and learned about the Viet Cong or the Taliban early on, they would not have wasted billions and billions of dollars and hundreds of thousands and millions of lives and destroyed countries. All that could have been avoided if people in the US government had made the effort to understand what these people wanted. And here we have a case in Palestine with Hamas and in Lebanon with Hezbollah as well, similarly. The second point is that the book really gives you great insights by people who are scholars, serious researchers, impartial analysts, even though some are Palestinians, but their mind is the mind of a academic analyst, but also activist. They're very clear about needing to present the facts honestly. And this book, the interviews, their thoughts, give you really important insights into the whole span of Hamas's being, of how they came into being. When did they turn to political work? They started as a social, they started as an Islamist advocacy movement. They wanted people to be more Islamic, to live a better life and to live a more decent life. And they came out of the Muslim Brotherhood tradition, which started way back in the 1930s in the Arab world. But they evolved. And this is one of the critical things about Hamas, which people don't understand. And Hezbollah is similar. It's remarkable how similar they are. But the evolution of Hamas from its origins as an Islamist movement to one that focused heavily, they had made a decision early on that they're not going to get into politics. They're not going to have a military wing. They're going to do social justice work, kindergartens, bakeries, women's literacy groups, whatever. They were focused on the ground, and this is, starting in this was in the early 1980s, or the late 1980s where they came into being. They focused on the social side of life, thinking that if we just strengthen the vitality and the integrity and the capabilities of our people, we will achieve what is our right eventually. But eventually they turned to resistance, because after the first Intifada and the second Intifada, they saw that the existing Palestinian political elite under the PLO, under Yasser Arafat, was not doing real resistance and was not achieving any serious national goals, and was getting nowhere near a peace agreement that was beneficial for Israelis and Palestinians. And what Hamas did was to strengthen its role, both as a resistance movement, but they saw themselves, and they still are today, and they are seen as the repository of the consensus of Palestinian nationalist rights and demands. The reason Hamas is important to understand is because they reflect, I think more accurately than any other group, the whole consensus among all Palestinians. We've had situations in the past where there was some kind of consensus within the PLO, but the PLO turned out to be, like most Arab governments, not efficient, rather corrupt, self-centered, selfish, and materialistic.
Unlike the U.S. government.
Well, like many governments, not all governments, there's some good governments, but they turned out to be not very good at achieving Palestinian rights. And they quickly gave in to the pressure of the U.S. and Israel, and then the possible agreements and what came after that, and things fell apart. The settlements kept expanding after 1993. Palestinians were jailed in the thousands. So you had this situation where there was nobody working for Palestinian national rights. And Hamas felt that it needed to step in and do that. They didn't expect to be able to achieve Palestinian rights in one fell swoop. but they felt that it was their moral and political responsibility to stand with the fundamental demands and rights of the Palestinian people. And the consensus that was prevalent among all Palestinians, including one of the most important constituencies for Hamas, is the Palestinians in jail. There's now about 8,000 to 9,000 Palestinians in jail in Israel, many of them with no charges or trials or anything. And the jailed Palestinian prisoners are a critical constituency for Hamas and for all the Palestinians. And in fact, many of the operations that they did when they kidnapped people, including partly of the October 7, aimed to take Israeli soldiers prisoner and then trade them for the Palestinians, which is exactly what these negotiations are all about. And if there is a ceasefire, it will include the release of thousands of Palestinian prisoners and the release of all the hostages. But this is something they saw was very important to do. They also evolved over the years, and this is another important aspect of Hamas which people don't appreciate. Again, you like them, you don't like them, that's your right. But you should understand them to be able to decide accurately if you like them or don't like them. If you hear Joe Scarborough say something that morning, you make a decision, then you're in trouble, you need help, politically and morally. You can't, listen to TV analysts in the United States who say things like about Hamas or Arabs or Muslims or whatever, and make a decision. You need to yourself and get the information and see that one of the things that defines these movements is that they evolve over time. So when Hamas started, their initial charter had phrases that were clearly anti-Semitic, or that people thought were anti-Semitic. And they didn't particularly care. Maybe they didn't understand. But maybe that was their way of fighting, saying, yeah, you're going to occupy me and kill me, well, take this. But they realized that this was not an effective thing to do. I don't know why they put it in, I'm just speculating. But they changed it, and when they reviewed their charter in 2017, they took out those phrases that were seen as anti-Semitic, and they clearly agreed to a two-state resolution, Israeli-Jewish state within the 67 borders, and Jewish majority Israeli state, about 20% Arab, including my family in Nazareth, and 80% Jewish. And then a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem, with certain adjustments made for the refugees that would be agreed by both sides. So this was an important change. The third point I wanted to make was that Hamas has, since around 1990 or so, they have made 11 ceasefire and peacemaking proposals to the Israelis. Sheikh Yassin, the first leader of Hamas, made an offer. The head of their military wing, way back 20 years ago, made an offer to Rami. There were indirect talks that happened in the 90s and 2000s. Hamas has continuously explored the possibility of a negotiated resolution of the conflict with Israel if the Palestinians get their rights. Now, the terms they laid out are often unacceptable to the Israelis, but so are the Israeli terms mostly unacceptable to us. But this is how negotiations happen. So the fact that they changed their charter, that they continuously made offers of coexistence and negotiated a long-term peaceful coexistence is significant, and people need to explore that more to see, is it serious? Is it realistic? Can it really move us somewhere good? And these decisions, by the way, another thing about Hamas that is so important and explains partly why it's successful, is that all of its decisions are collectively made. The media now here talks about Yahya Sinwar, the new head of Hamas, saying, oh, he's a radical militant and he's going to do this and do that. The people who write this stuff on TV or on the internet have no idea of how decisions happen in Hamas. It's one of the most, that's not democratic, but most consultative organizations for decision-making, national political decision-making in the Arab world, maybe in the whole global South. And they make decisions only after extensive consultations, including with the prisoners in Israeli jails, who have their own consultations and share them. So when they make a decision, it is a decision that is ratified by the whole group, which reflects, back to my first point, reflects the whole national Palestinian consensus. So I'm finished quickly. 2 minutes.
Say 1 or 2 points.
Yes, sorry about that. The last point I'd make is they are a resistance movement. They are the most pure and, let's say, dynamic or active. I'm trying to use adjectives that are not judgmental but just descriptive. That they're very active and they're very they stick to their guns. They're very pure in resisting. And the thing to understand about resistance movements is one that pertains not just to them but to all of these movements, and especially today, Hezbollah and Lebanon, with what's going on with Iran. And there's 2 words and 2 dates I want to give you to keep in your mind. This is not in the book. This is something I've been working on and we'll be writing up soon. The 2 words I want you to remember are humiliation and resistance. When people are humiliated, for whatever reason, African Americans, Black Africans, Algerians in France, or all over the world, in situations of colonialism or occupation or whatever, humiliated people will ultimately always resist in different ways. But to resist effectively and achieve your goals, whether through militant action or peaceful negotiations, or usually it's both, like South Africa, exactly, you start with militant actions and then you eventually negotiate. You have to have legitimacy. So humiliation leads to resistance, and resistance that's done with legitimacy can often succeed if it's done well. The 2 dates I'll give you for you to keep in mind are, if you're looking at Hamas, but also the whole Arab region, or Middle East region, are 1917 and 1953. 1917 was the Balfour Declaration, where England said, colonial England said to Great Britain, said they would support the creation of a Jewish home in Palestine. Palestine was 93% Arab. But this is how colonialism works. And they succeeded. They got their Jewish state in 1948. But 1917 was the basis of that process of humiliation, which the Palestinians and all Arabs still feel today.
Last point.
And 1953, last point. 1953 is the Iranian revolution. Not revolution, the Iranian overthrow of the democratically elected government by the US and the UK. It's no surprise that the US and the UK did these 2 humiliating feats in history and have led to resistance by the people. And the US and the UK today are the most enthusiastic supporters of the Israeli plausible genocide in Gaza. This circle has to be broken, and one way to break it is to read about the actors and understand it better so we can all play our role. Thank you, and I'm sorry I won't have that.
Let me just say, I am tasked with the violence of the timekeeper. We'll try to get some, but thank you. I think, Rami, when you said resistance and humiliation, it does seem to me the other side of humiliation is respect. And respect is not often confused with agreement, that one can respect one's enemy, but not necessarily at all agree with them. And negotiations are not with your friends, but with your enemies, the folks you disagree with. we have a dock strike going on, and it's not because the bosses and the unions agree with one another, but there needs to be some respect. And so I'd like to hear a little more about that, but I also want to just go back to this question of terrorism that's so pervasive in US media and US government policy, and frankly in the policies of many of the European governments that are resistant. How do we respect the diversity of views in the Palestinian struggle for self-determination? Hamas has won, but only one. And the word terrorism, it seems, cuts off conversations. So, Helena, I'd like to ask you, the New York Times, Fox News, some of our major, they suddenly have this epiphany that they've been misleading people. We need to, what would it take for them to understand Hamas as the major media? And then I'm going to ask each of you to be kind of brief, and then I have a question for Rami.
So, I worked for the London Sunday Times and the Christian Science Monitor for many years. And the Christian Science Monitor was a particularly interesting newspaper when I was working for it, because it was not subject to commercial pressures. It was owned by the Mother Church of Christ Scientist, which is fairly well known in New England, not terribly well known, outside of the United States. It's a specifically American small church that had a very strong mission for public education. Founded by a woman, I'm glad to say. But I had wonderful editors there, and they would just press me, Helena, go and interview this person again, go and interview that person. I was covering, tumultuous affairs during the beginning of the Lebanese Civil War, in which the PLO and its member organizations were a big part. So I interviewed a lot of them, and my editors would say, just wait till you get that last interview. You don't have to compete with the New York Times to get a scoop. Try to understand what the story is. So it was a great job to have. And then after I stopped doing daily journalism, I continued to contribute a regular column to the Christian Science Monitor on global affairs. But almost overnight, after they became reliant on advertising, they said, oh, Helena, we don't want your column anymore. Because the advertisers were putting a lot of pressure on them, as they did on National Public Radio and a lot of other news outlets that were trying to present, a more balanced view, especially on Arab-Israeli issues. So that's fine. I moved on and did other things. So I honestly am not holding my breath for the editorial board of the New York Times to suddenly have an epiphany. But were they to, I would say, first of all, read the book, Understanding Hamas, thank you, and why that matters, because, really, we delved into so many different issues here. The history of Hamas, the differences between Hamas and ISIS. One thing that I hear from some of my relatives in England is like, but isn't Hamas just like ISIS? No, they're very different. But you need to understand what those differences are. I mean, some of the differences are on the woman issue, for example. Some of them are on the issue of participating in democratic elections. Some of them are on the issue of respect for international law. There are so many differences. That's why we wanted to delve into this. So I'm not holding my breath for the editorial boards of the major corporate media, but I do think that through public education and public initiatives, the progressive movement in this country and all political movements in this country that want to avoid war, want to see an emphasis on diplomacy. I just want to make a couple of quick points about my main learnings from these conversations we had with 5 experts. One is that, you know, this idea that if you can destroy Hamas militarily by wiping out every single person in Gaza, that solves the problem. That does not solve the problem. Hamas is not only in Gaza. Gaza society actually contains a broad range of people with a broad range of political ideas and ideologies, but they work together on resistance. So, you know, Hamas is the leading member in a very broad resistance coalition. It is not the only member, and they have always said that they don't want to govern on their own. After they won the elections in which they participated in good order and good faith
2006.
in 2006, that were supervised, you know, monitored by the Carter Center and by the EU, and they were, you know, genuine parliamentary elections that Hamas won. Ismail Haniyeh, who was then the leader, who, as we know, was brutally murdered by the Israelis on July 31st, he said he doesn't want to Hamas to rule on its own. He wants to have a national coalition government. That has been their attitude throughout, that they want to be politically inclusive and to be politically included in, you know, whatever negotiations are going on. There's a lot to work with. The other thing is that Hamas is not just in Gaza. Hamas is in the West Bank. Hamas is in prisons. Hamas actually is wherever there are Palestinians, specifically in, you know, Jordan and Lebanon and Syria and the Gulf, as there are other Palestinian political trends. You know, Fatah still has supporters. The Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine has supporters. But if you're talking about the situation in Gaza or the West Bank today, they have joint operations movements, joint operations rooms between the activist members of all of these organizations. So the situation is much more complex than what, you know, if some ill-informed senator stands up here and say, you know, well, we've just got to support Israel as they demolish and destroy Hamas in Gaza. And, you know, that is just a recipe for the continuation of what I think, having studied a lot of genocides around the world, that is a genocide. And, you know, the way to end this is through getting an ironclad, lasting ceasefire.
Thank you. So, Rami, I'm going to turn to you. You know, the other word you mentioned besides humiliation was resistance. And a word that's come up a lot in the book, but also certainly as we've talked about in the media, is terrorism, as something that really cuts off negotiations, cuts off conversations. And I've looked, and even today, if there's a hospital that's bombed, if there's a school that's bombed, a refugee camp, 6 buildings, you know, there's always a terrorist leader located there as the argument of why it's okay to do this disproportionate slaughter of civilians. So I'd like you to unpack for us a little bit the foreign terrorist organization list, the whole notion of terrorism, and on the other side, and like, how can we get past that to unlawful acts? So what happened on October 7th, when to the extent there were civilians targeted by anybody and any civilians, that was wrong. That was an unlawful act, not an issue of terrorism. So like, unpack that a little bit and how the experts in the book talk about that. And the second thing though is, in terms of resistance, I think something that surfaced and it's raised as one of the questions in the book is there too high a cost for resistance? And given the suffering and just massive numbers, you know, Gaza is flattened. And what are Palestinians saying, both within Hamas and just at large? Is this too high a cost? But how does one continue that resistance in varieties of ways at this time?
Well, thank you. I'll answer.
Small question.
Yeah, I'll get ready to a short answer because I took too much time before. But the answer to the second question is there are cases, yes, where resistance is too costly and fails. Not all resistance succeeds. But all resistance that has the consensus support of its people tends to succeed, but it takes a long time. The Native Americans tried to resist the colonial invaders from Europe and couldn't. They just didn't have the means. The technology of guns was too much for them, and they lost. And they're still trying to resist today, culturally and in other ways. But there's examples like that where resistance simply didn't work. The Gaza situation is an extreme example of the price that people pay. Some people say that there has never been a national liberation movement, a decolonization movement, without a lot of death and bloodshed and suffering, and that's true. But it's the people, it's up to the people in those movements to decide what's too much and what's sufficient. The situation in Gaza is unprecedented. We've never seen anything like this. Equally unprecedented is the near total consensus in the Western world. Near total, there's a few countries, Ireland, Spain, that don't go along with it, but most of the West enthusiastically seems to go along with the U.S. British-led genocidal policies. Give them the guns they need, stop any ceasefire resolutions at the UN, don't do any embargoes on arms sales, and try to neuter the ICC and the ICJ. Most of the Western countries seem to go along with this. It's one of the most perplexing and awful realities of this situation, which makes me sense that what the Israelis are doing is not only exploding pagers and telephones, they're exploding the whole system of international law and human rights that the Western world developed after World War II in response to the genocide against the Jews. And the supreme ironies of this are supreme, they're just awful. But this is what's going on. And we have to figure out how to do it. So the change that, I think your other question was when will the media and others and government people change? We know from
a shift from like the terrorism label that cuts things off to the
so,
unlawful
yes.
acts that we can
Yes.
have any targeting of civilians rather than just labeling of someone, one group as terrorists.
Right. That's way too sophisticated an argument for anything in the public realm. That's for legal cases, but it's an important distinction. In the public realm, what happens is that the Zionist movement, with allies in the West, the various allies, has been extremely successful in achieving its goals of a Jewish state in Palestine, but also successful in promoting a narrative in most of the West about the bad guys, the Palestinians. And today they call them terrorists. They say they're like Qaeda, they're like ISIS. But if you go back, as I've done over the last 100 years, and you look at the propaganda and the public relations and the public narratives that the Zionist movement and the State of Israel has actively pushed, it always tries to link the foe of the day, the enemy of the day, which is usually the Palestinians, to link them to the worst thing in the world.
Which used to be the Soviet Union, do you remember that?
Right, so that's what I'm saying. It used to be the Soviet Union, it used to be Saddam Hussein, it used to be Al-Qaeda, it used to be oil blackmailers. The bad guys in the world have evolved over the years, and the pro-Israeli propaganda always links the Palestinians with these bad guys, which works well in many Western societies that only have superficial knowledge of the situation. And most people who watch American TV or read the New York Times don't know really much about the Middle East. So what they read, they accept. But the change happens not by anything that one can measure, like we did this and this happened. It happens over time, and you see it happening today so dramatically with the young people in the United States, the progressive Jewish movements, the progressive churches, some labor unions, Black and Hispanic and women's movements. There's all kinds of movements, and many of them have come together in the unpermitted vote movement. But this change is so strong and visible among young people. And because they don't rely on the mainstream media or politicians for their knowledge, they get it from social media and some alternative media. The same thing happened, I remember, and those of you old enough to remember the 1960s in Vietnam, when the Vietnam protests started, these people were seen as a bunch of hippie kooks, troublemakers. But slowly over time, more and more people realized that what was happening in Vietnam was wrong or wasn't going to succeed, and the U.S. finally pulled out. But the change is going to happen more slowly here, but it is happening already. You see it in the polling evidence, you see it among the age differences, the media, and there's other examples where this is happening, and it needs information. We keep feeding knowledge into it. People go and visit, and they see, but it's the social media that has shown people in their telephones what the state of Israel is doing in real terms, and this is causing a great reaction against Israel.
Thanks, Rami. We're running out of time, and we want to make sure folks have time to buy books and to have informal conversation. But I'd like to just lift up something you said, Rami, and just offer you both a chance for some closing comments. But you know, you lifted up how important the prisoners were for Hamas and for Palestinians more broadly, and I certainly learned that in terms of meeting with some of the I think the Palestinian Authority even has a minister for the prisoners. And the U.S. is certainly with the highest incarcerated population, might learn something from Palestinians on this point. But you know, in South Africa, Mandela and others, the African National Congress, described Robben Island as the university. That it was a place that folks learned, whether they were there for a few weeks or many, many years or decades. And so, with that, I'd love for each of you to say, as you have these conversations with these five experts and also the experience you both bring in terms of years of studying and even engaging with folks on Hamas and the broader issues that you've raised around resistance and liberation, what surprised you most? Like one thing that surprised you in the conversations that led into this book that you want to share with everybody and would encourage folks to kind of get the book right away and read it tonight. So Helena first, and then Rami, what surprised you?
Gosh, that's a big question, because I've done a lot of prep work for these conversations. You know, having good conversations in a webinar doesn't just happen. So we had a lot of preparatory conversations. I think one of the things that struck me was, I think it was Dr. Khaled Haroub. I'm going to say two or three things that really struck me. Dr. Khaled Haroub said that Hamas he's looked at a lot of political movements in the area of historic Palestine, or maybe in the Levant more broadly, and in his estimation, Hamas is the movement that has never had splits. I mean, as we know, Fatah has had a lot of splits. The Popular Front became, the Popular Democratic Front and the Popular Front for the Popular Front General Command, and they all split and they split. But he also looked at the Israeli political system, and he said, the old Labour Party split in so many ways, and Likud split in so many ways. And he, I think, attributed this. It has to be noted that Dr. Haroub is his own politics are not Islamist, pro-Hamas politics, but he's a very good analyst. And he was trying to understand, why it has had this kind of stability, this longevity. I think the other thing that really struck me was hearing Dr. Jeroen Gunning talk about critical terrorism studies and the way that affixing this label of terrorist to a resistance movement, both in a sort of anti-colonial context or in an anti-occupation context, it's a very common move by repressive powers that seek to use that label in order to justify and excuse their own massive use of violence up to the level of genocide.
Thanks. Rami, what surprised or challenged you the most in this process?
I think 2 points. One was the incessant attempts and insistence by Hamas to be part of a national consensus and to forge that consensus when it didn't exist or to repair it when it was broken. They didn't want to rule Palestine. They wanted to be part of a national government that represented all Palestinians and if need be made compromises at some points, but they agreed on those compromises and they constantly worked to do that. When Fatah under Mahmoud Abbas and under U.S. pressure and Israeli pressure didn't do that, then Hamas just ruled Gaza on its own and had no other option. The second point that surprised me was the amount of consultation that took place within Hamas's constituencies to achieve the position that it took. And that's why the positions that it took remained constant and clear, and they wouldn't budge. The Israelis, the Americans, the Jordanians, the Fatah, everybody tried to induce them to just do this and we'll give you this, and they wouldn't do it. They just stuck to their guns. They're such a pure example of pure resistance because they feel that what they are aspiring for is their right. They're not trying to kill Jews or take their land away or do this. They're just asking for their rights, internationally enshrined rights. And that's why they have such confidence in what they're doing. And the prisoners issue is fascinating because it was the prisoners in prison about 15, 20 years ago that first came up with a national consensus document. It was called the Prisoners Document, about the positions that any Palestinian leadership should take in negotiating with or in talking with the U.S. or Europe or Israel or whoever. And there's so much respect for the prisoners because these are people who risked their lives and often lost their lives for fighting for the rights of the Palestinian people. So they have inordinately high amount of respect among Palestinians, and they will play a huge role once they come out of prison and re-engage in national political life. So the point that you said, I didn't reply, the terrorism issue versus legitimate, my view on this has always been if we should discuss any terror act by any party, and we should not hesitate to criticize it, to demonize it, to put it on trial if anybody does terrorism. But we can't do that if we only do it for one party in a conflict. Because terrorism, accountability, like justice, has to be indivisible and universal. It has no meaning if you just say this is a terrorist act. And certainly Arab parties have carried out many terrorism acts. And if you measure terrorism by the number of innocent people who died in a political contest, the Western imperial powers have way more to account for than we do, but that's a separate accounting that will be done later. But for the Arab-Israeli conflict, unless we judge both sides according to the same moral and legal standard, we are being criminal, dishonest hypocrites. And that's why this discussion usually goes nowhere. And one of the things that would be good is for people like the various church groups and others, the social justice groups, to convene discussions discussions, not public things on CNN, but rational discussions among experts to look at this issue and decide, who's doing bad things and how can we stop that, because this is going to be one of the ways to lead to a breakthrough.
Thank you, Rami. And let's give both Helena and Rami a hand. Thank you so much for this meeting. And more importantly, thank you for doing this work and this journey, as it were, and inviting all of us to be a part of that journey. And so now I want to invite everybody else to have a chance to talk informally, meet our authors here, Helena and Rami, but also buy the books. And I want to just say that tonight, any books that are purchased tonight here, 10% of the proceeds will go to the organization Heal Palestine that is working to support the community in Gaza. So there's an opportunity to make a difference, really. But also, I hope you will find studies, as Colin mentioned, in terms of the banning of books. Have a book study group. Use this book to do your own webinars in person, not just online. To have the tough conversations. And this book will challenge and surprise you as well. And so, Rami and Helena, once again, thank you so much for this evening and this work. And thank you all for coming tonight.